Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And as Ben said at the outset, I don't have a structured presentation. I was asked to fill in, and I'll do my best to share some very personal comments. So all I'm going to say doesn't really reflect the affiliations we have with the OSCE and other institutions, but in the Q&A, if there are questions about what the OSCE is doing around Ukraine or other crises, I'll be happy to address those questions. I will really limit myself to 3 points of a much less technical or academic nature on this broad topic of an agenda for prevention. The first point I will make is about, I think, our failure in recent years and decades to reconcile our much more comprehensive and complete understanding of conflict and drivers of conflict with a trend of a very different nature at the macro level in the direction of an erosion of our international security system and our structures for peace, especially at the multilateral level, so that we're now faced with a situation where we know a lot about what drives conflict, what may help with prevention, and at the same time, we might be entering an era of not just localized wars or regional wars, but wars of a global scale, of a more conventional type that we have ever seen since World War II. The second point is about the need in the wake of the war in Ukraine, but especially with the view to the risk of future war on a global scale, to really build a much larger coalition of actors and stakeholders that are united in their common interest in preserving a view of international security as possibly as a positive sum game as opposed to a zero-sum game, overcoming the many divisions, some of which will never be solved, between those who really specialized on peace building and those who work more on security issues. But I think we have a common interest in really facing the common enemies that are those that don't believe in peace at all in any possible way. And I will say more about that. And the final point is about really re-empowering, reappreciating and re-empowering Europe, not just the EU as an institution, but Europe as a peace actor, and in light of the peace project nature of Europe from its very beginning. So as to the first point, I think we have had a good illustration already today with the 2 presentations we just heard, that our understanding of conflict, drivers of conflict, has deepened, in my view, immensely over the past decades. We have been able to really broaden our understanding of conflict, focusing on the nexus between conflict and inequality, conflict and development, conflict and marginalization of groups, communities, minorities, the whole women, peace and security agenda, the youth agenda, connecting, of course, dynamic of conflict with environmental degradation, the challenge posed by climate change. So I think we haven't failed to understand conflict. We've actually broadened as never before our understanding and deepened it and made it much more complete. And some of these ideas, even if the debate continues under different voices, some of these ideas have really been already mainstreamed. I mean, Roberta did a great job at highlighting all the good things that the European Union is doing on many levels. So these ideas are not only in books, they are now enshrined in policies and institutions. So I don't think the failure to prevent conflict, has to do with the failure of our understanding, but it's to really do conflict. Where we have been weak is doing conflict prevention as opposed to understanding conflict prevention. But all this was happening against the backdrop that we were all familiar with, but we were paying not enough attention of a progressive, as I mentioned it, erosion of our international security system against the backdrop of intensifying international competition in general. All these phenomena that are studied in schools, such as this one, and so we are now faced with the sort of disconnect. We've been very good at understanding conflict, diagnosing, the dynamics of conflict, but we're lacking the actors, especially at the state level. We have a lot of, stakeholders active at the sub-state level, at the non-governmental level, but we're faced with a reality in which many state actors, even if they have mainstreamed these ideas in their policy, they're actually betting on international competition, and they've come to the conclusion, thankfully not all of them, but some of them, that military confrontation and the active use of military power is not just acceptable, but it's useful, that can bring good results, and that's something that we had thought to be able to overcome. I mean, the idea that, yes, sometimes, as you mentioned, conflict is unavoidable, but when it becomes of a violent nature and military nature, at the end of the day, everybody loses. If you look at what happened in the Middle East in recent years, where conflict was very much a reality, before our war in Europe with Ukraine, you can't deny that the use of military power was a very powerful factor, not in ending conflict. I don't think any of these Middle Eastern conflicts have ended, but in at least reaching some sort of temporary stability for some of the regimes that were threatened by conflict. And you can't explain the Syrian civil conflict by looking at just political dynamics. In the end, whatever stability we have in Syria right now, or in Libya, was achieved at the point of the gun, because some countries put boots on the ground and they mobilized their forces, and we have to in a way reckon with that. So my first point is really about trying to understand that whatever we do in the field of peace building now and conflict prevention can no longer just have the luxury to focus on localized dynamics of conflict within specific countries of regions, but we need to be aware that we might be faced with a background of conflict at a much larger scale, of a more conventional kind, and that interstate conflict that never ceased to exist. We've paid a lot of attention on civil conflict, internal conflict. Bernardo this morning mentioned even the dynamic of violent extremism, terrorism. But interstate conflict has always taken place, even during the Cold War. This idea that, however, there was this sort of long peace, at least in Europe, as a backdrop to all of that, I think has largely evaporated. Second point, which leads me to the second point of this idea of building a coalition as broad as possible. Especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine, there are lively debates in all of our countries. Italy, I think, is a notable and somewhat worrying case. And even those who sort of stand for peace, they have very different understandings about what peace means and how you reach peace. And there's a very divisive debate about the role of military power and defense and deterrence in preserving peace, with opposite camps. People believing that rearmament or investment in defense is a recipe for more conflict, and those who argue that in this particular situation, armed resistance of Ukraine and more investment in defense in Europe is the only possible way out of what may deter some actors from pursuing even larger plans implemented by force. And I think these debates will not go away, and we will never reconcile different views, and it's very much to do also with our background and our different professional affiliations, where we stand in society. I think what is important at this very crucial turning point is to really focus more on what unites us than what divides us, and to really focus on what our enemies are. And I think we have two broad categories of enemies. Those countries and those actors that are really betting, as I said, on international conflict, not just international competition, as a way to advance state or societal interest of a security nature, economic nature, political nature, and those who still hold on to the view that security and peace are best served by international cooperation, broad and large. And I think if that becomes the parameter, then some of these differences can be reconciled or can be sort of set aside for the moment, right? And the other broad range of enemies, to my view, are all those that for various reasons have become indifferent to the reality of conflict. The too many within also those that subscribe to a view of peace, including in people active in the peace movements, who have a very passive view of what it takes to preserve peace, and they are so outraged by the outbreak of war that they fail to see that peace is something that you actively have to build, and you can't remain indifferent to the outbreak of war or to the violation of basic rights, and basic principles. And a forum such as this one, which Bernardo tells me was born with this ambition to act as a sort of bridge between the researchers on peace building, peace studies, and the practitioners, can go a step further, in my view, trying to bridge also the communities of those who deal with international security, who are not necessarily all of them warmongers or imbued with securitized views of the world and international politics, and those who work on peace building, especially at this very crucial time that where we're really faced with the prospect of war at the global scale. I'm not going to mince my words. I think it's the risk of something resembling a World War III is very real. Is something that we should all be facing. And the final point is really about Europe, which was in the guiding question of today's panel, and the role that Europe can play. And I think here we really have to rediscover the origins of the European integration project as much more than an economic and a political project, but really a peace project from the very beginning, built on the ashes of World War II. And Europe as a place of peace, but also as an actor of peace, which again doesn't mean, at least in my view, having a sort of view of Europe as a civilian actor only, who rejects even the idea of conflict is something that is thinkable. As Juan said, conflict is part of human interactions at the personal level, family level, community level, and international level. But as an actor that, knowing how much it can lose from a great power competition and a possible great power war, really actively uses all of its tools. And again, Roberto did a great job at explaining the toolbox that the European Union, for instance, has, but the same applies to the OSCE, the UN, and other institutions. The toolbox is there, but is that connected to the sort of high politics of our, nation states? The strategic compass in a document that the EU recently released, how much of that is about conflict prevention? How much of that? And when we are talking about a more geopolitical Europe, are we really thinking about a Europe that is in the position to avoid that actors such as China, the US, ever come to this situation of competing, not just economically or strategically, but may even clash militarily with each other? So I would not look at Europe as a sort of actor that, standing for peace, remove itself from the competition, but an actor that uses all of its tools and its history and its credibility to make a difference when it comes to the next few years, which could be very turbulent next few years. And Europe would easily become a battleground in any future major confrontation between great powers. So, we have really a lot to lose as one of the most integrated economies in the world, and one of the continents that have invested the least in defense and security in recent decades. Again, these are just very personal and very general comments compared to the two presentations. Maybe we ought to be opening the floor and letting people ask their questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.